Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight, and I'm very pleased to welcome the return of Liam Duffy. Liam, how are you doing?
Not too bad, mate. How are you doing?
Yeah, great. How's life treating you in general? It's been a while since we spoke, but I think the issues have pretty much remained the same, haven't they?
Yeah, I have a feeling we're probably going to cover some of the same ground that we covered last time, but maybe we've got some new followers that didn't hear us last time, so hopefully we'll keep it fresh and interesting.
I think there have been a few developments in certain areas as well. You've just put out an excellent report on the Yazidis, which I've read and absorbed, and it was quite harrowing for a number of reasons. And I don't see many people dealing with this topic, so I'm really grateful that's what you're spending a lot of your time on. Before we get into the particulars of that, maybe you could just reiterate for people who've not seen you on the show before, how do you describe what you do? What takes up your time?
Oh, I have no idea what I do, to be honest, right now. As much as anything, I'm an advisor for the Counter Extremism project, which is a think tank based in New York, which, as the name suggests, works on extremism and counterterrorism. So they've got offices in Brussels, in London, in Berlin, New York. So very much a global presence, global footprint. Do Islamist extremism, jihadism, far right. Obviously, those are the main threats, but obviously looking at different threats in the future as well. My work mainly focuses on Islamism, of the non-violent variety, but also jihadism as well. That's just kind of where my interest is. And I guess been doing a lot of writing recently, which we talked about before the show, kind of Spectator and Unheard a bit recently. So that's kind of what my output's been doing recently.
Yeah, I was just mentioned your writing before we started recording, and I was just saying how laser sharp it was. I've really enjoyed it, especially writing in the Spectator for sure. So, you mentioned there that you're affiliated with and you produce content for and work with the Counter Extremist project, or is it Counter Extremism project?
Extremism. Yep.
Extremism. So a lot of people obviously will see groups like that, and they'll have preconceived notions about the political leanings, about fundings, things like that. And I suppose that's a polite way of describing how people often react to these sort of organisations. But what can you tell us about that sort of thing regarding the counter-extremism project? Do they have any overt political leanings or any sort of odious funding that one may have highlighted or would want to point out?
Well, if there's odious funding, I'm certainly not going to admit to it on a YouTube stream. But no. Just out of interest, was you talked about people might kind of come in with their own ideas of political leanings. What out of interest might those be? I've been in this field for a while, so I don't know really how people perceive it from the outside, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently.
Anything that doesn't parrot the established liberal narrative of Islam is a religion of peace, terrorism has nothing to do with religion, is generally considered right-leaning or conservative, much to my dismay, because I'm a left-leaning liberal and these things trouble me for all the really obvious left-leaning reasons. But there is a perception that any organisation that's taking a specific focus on Islamism or jihadism must be either coming from the Christian right or a right-wing mentality, strangely.
Well, just from the organisation's point of view, they do a hell of a lot of work on the far right, especially in the last year or two. We've obviously, for obvious reasons, we've seen some pretty horrific attacks around the world, and not what I personally would call terrorism, but like extremism and political violence in the United States very recently as well, obviously. So we do a hell of a lot of work on the far right. I just don't personally, for various reasons. It's just I don't feel like I know as much about it as a lot of other people in the organization and a lot of other people around the field. But yeah, in terms of what you said about the kind of establishment or kind of liberal consensus on that issue, I guess actually, and this is digressing slightly, I guess a large part of my work recently, apart from the Yazidi stuff that you mentioned, was I've been trying to forge a kind of a third way in that debate that's kind of, as you know, has kind of been the same debate back and forth since 9/11, really.
Yeah.
So that you kind of have one crowd saying, it's everything to do with religion, and one crowd kind of reacts to that and it says, it's nothing to do with religion. It's religion of peace, minority, and stuff like that. And it's just, it's just a totally sterile and kind of it hasn't really moved forward in a long, long time. So I mean, another recent thing that I put out was really to try and shift our attention to Islamism, to see it more as a political ideology of its own, and that's kind of what distinguishes the ism part on the end instead of like Islamic. Because I do get the arguments. I get that we don't want to appear kind of chauvinistic towards Islam and Muslims. We don't want to like make anybody feel uncomfortable, and I do get that. And of course, it's got nothing to do with the majority of Muslims, but that's a very different proposition to saying it's got nothing to do with Islam. The ideology, the political ideology of Islamism, obviously does have a connection to Islam, the faith, and you couldn't say that Islamists are not kind of believers in their doctrine. But I think
some people do.
Still useful.
Some people really lean into that.
Do. Yeah, yeah. No, of course they do, and but that's I think why I've been trying to find a way to talk about this that doesn't make people feel uncomfortable and makes people, because I think the more uncomfortable we are, the less progress we make on this, and the less the key institutions that we need to take action on this will take action. So I really think there's benefit to viewing it more as a political ideology, and I don't just say that for cynical reasons. I mean, like the evidence is starting to pile up that actually it's where Islamism as a political ideology, has kind of laid down its roots after the last few decades, is where we've had the extremism and the terrorism. So it's not a cynical ploy at all. I think there's real benefit to shifting that perception of it.
Yeah, sure. And obviously you want to be able to convince people and persuade people. So being inflammatory never helps. Of course, generalizing never helps. So it is all, I suppose it's about what you want to achieve in this space. Do you want to just win a row, or do you want to encourage people to look more deeply at the issue, which is, I see that time and time again in your writing. It is very balanced and nuanced on this issue. I hate that word nuance now. It seems to be overused, but it's indispensable in some areas.
It's funny. Some people would say I'm not balanced and I'm not nuanced enough. So it's nice to hear that.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, you'd only have to take 10 minutes looking at their output on their, relative social media stream to get a grip on what their idea of balanced or reasonable is 9 times out of 10. Well, last time you were on the show, we spoke about one of Britain's most famous exports now, which is Shamima Begum. Famously travelled to Syria to join the Islamic State, and ever since then there have been constant debates and legal proceedings about whether or not she should return to the UK, a country of birth, to stand trial. Or should I say appeal the decision to strip her citizenship from her. Now, I don't recall, last time we spoke, had her citizenship been stripped by Sajid Javid at the Home Office? I think it may have.
I think it had, but don't quote me on that, even though this is a recording.
So I'll just ask you then really about how you feel now, because my position has changed back and forth on this. I think it stayed the same since we last spoke, but about the idea of her not being allowed to appeal in the UK about her citizenship. She has to do anything she has to do from the camp she currently finds herself in Syria.
If I remember rightly, your position was, on balance, it would be better for her to come home, but it wasn't. I think your words were, you're not going to go out in the street and campaign about it or something.
Yeah, I'm not going to lean into it. I'm not, and I completely empathise and understand the opposing view. I just think on principle, I think my reasoning was she was our creation. We should take responsibility and not basically burden the people of Syria with her as a problem, given how much they've, many of them have no doubt suffered under her already. So I'm just kind of wondering where you are on it.
Well, I think events have made my position evolve forcibly, really. Like, I think I'm still the same as you. If I'm not against her coming back, and I do say that in the knowledge. I mean, you often hear people say, she should come back and face justice in the UK. She's our responsibility and stuff. But I think we spoke last time, and we said, actually, like, it's all very well saying she should face justice, but the chances of that happening are pretty slim. Like, I think we mentioned, we've had like 450 returnees from Syria and Iraq already, 40 charged, I think, or 40 convicted. I can't remember off the top of my head. not all of them for terrorism offences related to Syria and Iraq. So we're like far below 10% of the total number of returnees. I mean, the other kind of curveball in this is the other most famous exports, the Beatles, the two surviving members of the Beatles. We've kind of offloaded them to the US because there was no confidence that they could be of being able to secure a conviction in the UK. I mean, like that. This is all in the public domain. You can see what the Crown Prosecution Service said about that, and they basically said, despite all the evidence, we can't be confident that we can get these guys. So imagine if they came home. These are guys who helped torture and murder Alan Henning and David Haynes and James Foley and people like that. It would just be shocking if they were allowed to come home and kind of live freely and get on with their lives.
Well, I mean, just honing back in on that figure of 450 or so returned jihadis as an estimate to the UK. I mean, that is the scenario we have then, really, isn't it? There's a high probability that rapists, executioners, torturers are actually walking around the UK freely at this moment in time.
It is. It's difficult to say exactly because we don't know who exactly has returned yet. We don't know. We don't really know who's been killed in the conflict zone. We don't have a full picture, at least in public, of who still remains in the camp and who might have been killed or who we think has been killed but might be trying to work their way back to the UK. Like Abdel Barry got arrested in Spain. He was the guy they originally thought was Jihadi John a while back before it was identified as Mohammed Amwazi. He turned up in Spain and got arrested recently. So you do need to make differentiations there. Some of those people will have gone there, stayed a few months, and come straight back and thought, Jesus Christ, like what did I do?
One star on TripAdvisor.
Yeah, exactly. That wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Some of them will have got out when the going got tough, when the tide started turning against them, which is pretty cynical. And then those remaining in the region are probably the ones who are like the last holdouts, the ones who didn't leave until the very last. So it's difficult. I don't want to make any sweeping generalizations about like every single person of that 450 was a total monster who did X, Y, and Z. But certainly the probability, 300 have returned to France, 100 or so to Germany, a couple of hundred to Scandinavian countries. There are people in those cohorts who have committed crimes against humanity. I think that's I'm pretty confident saying that. And they've been able to get on with their lives.
Obviously, there was this narrative that took hold around Shamima Begum about this sort of doughy-eyed young girl who had no idea what she was getting into. And I think it's important to stress as well, and not enough people have, that we had a full view of what the Islamic State was before she made the decision to head out there. And also there's been some reports, and I'm not sure, maybe you can enlighten me into how we can verify them or how credible they are, about things she actually did herself while she was there. People have made accusations that she kept slaves herself, that she may even have been responsible for sewing people into suicide vests. And, it kind of dissolves away this picture of this innocent young girl not knowing what she was getting into sort of narrative.
Mm. Yeah, I've been mulling those reports about the sewing people into the suicide vests, and it complicates the narrative, sure, but personally, I wouldn't be comfortable, using that against her, because I just didn't see enough kind of evidence. Anybody could have come along and made those allegations. And this is the problem with the whole situation. You've mentioned about kind of it's become a very polarized issue, and it, in some ways this kind of really deeply complex moral and legal question has been consumed by the culture wars that are going on about everything else around us, including the worst pandemic of the century. Has been consumed by culture wars, and this is what's kind of happened with this a little bit. And not many people are really willing to look how complex this is in the face and admit how complex it is, and admit there are trade-offs and pros and cons and serious security implications of this as well. And just on that narrative you talked about her kind of activities while she was with ISIS. I kind of had a joke with a colleague. Was a semi-serious joke actually, but we had a joke with a colleague about we should make a kind of Chris Morris-esque TV show about like a returnee who kind of becomes a minor celebrity. And I had to text him recently because I had to say, actually, we better do this before kind of reality outstrips the parody or outruns the parody there. I think this is the thing. Like I forgot to say before, I can countenance the idea of her coming home. I can't countenance the idea of her becoming like a minor celebrity and doing university tours and talking about her experience with some of like the unsavory groups that dot the UK landscape, and she's got there's going to be a film about her at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas. It's just
God, you're right. You're absolutely right. That would happen, wouldn't it? That would be the nightmare we'd live in.
I think so, yeah. And the security services have said, and this was what was said in the decision to uphold her exclusion from the UK, was we need to take the security implications seriously. And sure, we do. But what are the chances of her, launching an attack when she comes home? Probably pretty slim. But I think there's a serious chance that she poses a serious challenge to like social cohesion, public trust between groups, and it just becomes a shit show, honestly. Like a really incendiary kind of moment in this culture war that really escalates it. And as much as anything, it's kind of that to make this kind of icon or celebrity out of her would be really kind of spitting on the mass graves of Yazidis and Kurds and Syrians and Iraqis as well. If she has to come home, then so be it. But I don't think this kind of lionization should happen.
No. Okay. So I suppose the final thing I'll probably ask about her until it develops further. I mean, I suppose one of the things that doesn't work in her favour in terms of public response is that she's very unrepentant. She's said that she's been fine with things such as beheading because they were Islamic. She claimed the Manchester bombing was justified, and this is all from her Syrian, prison camp at the same time as which she's actually trying to come home as well. So it didn't really engender any sort of love for her from the mainstream British public. But there are some that will counter that by saying, well, she's under duress. She can't be seen to go against the Islamic State's narrative while she's there because that would endanger her. So, I mean, I suppose I am asking you to do a bit of mind reading here, but in your gut feeling, can we take her as sincere, or is there something to this argument of duress?
No idea, honestly.
That's a fair answer.
No, sorry. I can't give you... we don't really know what's happening on the ground. There's a lot of... I'm sure she'll be getting a lot of kind of legal advice and PR advice and some NGOs kind of trying to prepare the ground, which is, that's their right to do. They want to lobby for her return and stuff. That's fine. But interestingly, I think like we've seen this change, like you said, when she first turned up, she was very unrepentant and very, very detached from the violence that she was discussing, which really, just was quite obvious. But now we've had this kind of makeover in the press, and like we've had the film, and I can't help but think that the people who are trying to help her are actually, making it worse, because they're making the public dig their heels in, because people don't like seeing that kind of very artificial and very like, it looked staged, that photo shoot, like a Primark photo shoot that happened the other day. And I really don't, I think that's polarizing even worse. I think if she has to come home, like, don't rub it in people's face, because actually you mentioned the Manchester attack, like what Shamima Begum has become, is like an avatar for both sides to project their anxieties and their preferences for how we deal with the phenomenon of jihadist terrorism. She's an avatar for all the pain that the Manchester bombing inflicted and all the other attacks. There isn't a Salman Abedi left to be angry with, but there is a Shamima Begum to be angry at. So it's a bit strange, really, that 900 to 1,000, maybe even more Brits joined ISIS, but really we spend all of our time and energy talking about one, and it's because she's become a symbol and a totem, and that's why I think the people who are trying to support her may not be helping, actually.
Yeah, and obviously we can spot. I mean, if the Brits can see anything, we can see cynicism a mile off. I think with this,
because we're so cynical.
Yeah, well, talking about moving on rather to a much more important issue in my eyes, and I believe in yours as well, is the plight of the Yazidi people. And you've just put out an excellent report in association with the Counter Extremism project called Foreign Fighters and Yazidi Genocide, I believe.
Yeah, Western Foreign Fighters. Foreign
Fighters. So that bit's very important.
Yeah, it is.
And it's quite a harrowing read. It is a lot of accounts of people Yazidis who suffered under members of ISIS, both male and female, which might come as a big surprise to many people listening. But before we get into that and talk about where the situation is today, maybe you can just explain to people who don't know, who are the Yazidi? How can you describe them? What are their sort of religious? What is their religious identity, rather?
Yeah, I mean, their religious identity is the whole reason and the whole driving force behind how they got thrown into this mess, really. So they're a religious minority, mainly in Iraq, but there are Yazidis in Syria, in Turkey, and Iran as well. But in particular, so they practice a pre-Islamic religion. It's kind of very, it's been around a long time, and it takes in elements of Christianity, of Judaism, and Islam, and so. For somebody like Tom Holland, who spoke recently about the research that you mentioned, he knows a lot about the Yazidis and spoke very movingly about their kind of beliefs and their practices and things like that. And very, by all accounts, a very kind of, beautiful cultural, kind of a community that has survived for an awful long time, despite several attempts to exterminate them. Actually, as what the Yazidis think as many as 70 attempts to exterminate them in their history. 70, sorry. So the whole issue about them practicing a pre-Islamic faith is the important part, because according to Islamic State's ideology, that meant that essentially they would have to answer for their existence, for their continued existence on come doomsday. I know this sounds crazy, and we've talked about our inability to conceptualize what jihadists actually believed before, but really, that when you kind of look at it in the kind of apocalyptic way that they do, they're trying to usher in the end times. They believe that they would be held responsible for the continued existence of these kind of polytheistic communities, which makes them very different to Christians and Jews. So Christians, technically, although they were heavily persecuted under Islamic State, they were technically allowed to live in Islamic State's territory as long as they paid the tax, the jizya. The Yazidis were not eligible for that tax. So Islamic State theologians and strategists came up with this justification for exterminating the Yazidi population of Iraq. So a couple of months after they declared their caliphate in Mosul in June 2014, they kind of descended without warning I say without warning, that's a complicated story that we probably shouldn't get into, but they descended on Sinjar, which is the ancestral home of the Yazidis. When they got there, they executed basically all of the men, all of the grown men, all of the women that they couldn't take as sex slaves. So about 3,000 people were executed as soon as they descended on Sinjar, their bodies kind of thrown into mass graves which are still getting dug up every few weeks. Like a new mass grave is found in Iraq. And estimates vary, but I think one of the most reliable is about 6,800 women and children were snatched. People who couldn't outrun Islamic State were kidnapped and trafficked and enslaved as kind of the spoils of war throughout Islamic State territory. So that's how it began.
The report mentions as well that there was some intervention, from the USA in terms of airstrikes and trying to prevent as much of this as possible. I do believe it was voted down in UK Parliament. What were your thoughts? I mean, what are your thoughts on that sort of interventionist action where you see a clear threat and you maybe as a military superpower do have the means to do something about it? Are you somebody who would absolutely be in favour of intervention?
In those circumstances, yeah. Like I've thought about this before. It's almost like you couldn't make it up as a kind of dummy exercise for whether humanitarian intervention was necessary or not. We had a few thousand Yazidis who outran the initial onslaught, went up Mount Sinjar, which is the mountain around, that Sinjar is the villages and towns surround. And they were up there dying of thirst and starvation. And, this is the middle of summer in Iraq. This is not a walk in the park by any means. And, there are people were eating leaves, people were eating the bark off trees to survive. Kids were dying of thirst as they were trying to escape. So basically they faced an impossible choice. It was stay on the mountain and die of thirst or starvation, or descend the mountain, take your chances with the jihadists, which for women meant enslavement, for kids meant indoctrination into Islamic State forces. For men, it meant a bullet in the head. So I think I'm I'm not by any means a kind of out and out interventionist on foreign policy, but on that issue, I think that's a clear cut case.
I mean, one of the things you point out in this report is that the Yazidis don't necessarily have any representation or interest groups in the Western world, really. I mean, there are a few organisations, but nothing that you would find for, say, Christians or Jews or Muslims, simply because they're a pretty not very well understood minority anyway. They don't really have any sort of demographic presence outside of that area. And just wondering, why is it that you don't think others have maybe took on this issue with a bit more force? Because you mentioned in your report as well, and I'm guilty of it obviously, but we spend a lot more time talking about the human rights of the potential jihadists returning than we do about justice for Yazidis and all they faced.
Oh, there's so many reasons. I think that some of them I'm not confident about, some of them I'm pretty sure, some of them I'd rather keep to myself, but there's so many different reasons I think that this hasn't really taken off as an issue. I mean, just before I get into that, I do think like that I was kind of, I'm not a public figure by any means, so if I was, maybe it would have got more reach, but I was really pleasantly surprised by the reach and engagement that the paper got, that you mentioned, and that kind of told me that actually there are a lot of people who are out there in various countries who actually do kind of feel deep inside them that this is a kind of unresolved issue, that we all remember the news cycles and the headlines of seeing Yazidi fleeing up the mountain with their children and entire families and all of their belongings in hand, and we remember seeing our own citizens boast about it on social media, and people remember that, and it's not easy to forget. There is a deep feeling that has been left unresolved, but not a lot of people know what to do or how to do something about that. And one of the reasons for that is there isn't like you said, there isn't a lot of Yazidi representation in Western countries. So there's not a big organization saying, this is something we need to deal with. There are some organizations doing really valiant stuff, but it's just not, it has fallen off the radar. And I mean, one of the things I really, really wanted to dispel, and sorry, we can come back to this if you wanted to talk about it later, but this kind of, this really infantilizing discourse around our own citizens who joined Islamic State, I think has really softened the demand for justice. This whole kind of, this narrative of why 900 to 1,000 Brits left, why a couple of thousand Frenchmen left to join ISIS, that there were these kind of charismatic and nefarious gurus online that were reaching out to the fragile and the vulnerable into their bedrooms and one by one kind of plucking them from their happy homes. That's just not what happened. It's simply not what happened. That may have happened in some cases, but it doesn't explain the phenomenon. It doesn't explain the sheer numbers of people. It takes what happened out of all of its historical and social and ideological context. Like I said, we can come back to that. Probably best if we do, because otherwise I'll get going on it. But it's painted the jihadists as my colleague Simon Cottee says, as more sinned against than in sin, or more sinned against than sinner. They're kind of the victims out of this situation, and actually that's just really kind of morally unserious. Like, yeah, there were some kids that were taken and they didn't have a choice and stuff like that, but that doesn't explain what happened at all. And that narrative has been really, really bad for the Yazidis, I think, actually, and is insulting as well. And as I hope the paper showed, like, they're aware of it. Like, Yazidis know that that's how jihadists are spoken about in a lot of Western countries, and it makes them deeply upset and deeply traumatized that they're still living in really wretched conditions, and we're kind of talking about the people who raped and tortured them as victims.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and the victim narrative makes this conversation really, really difficult. And I suppose there's something there that I'd want to pick, try and expand on a bit, not to wade headfirst into the gender wars by any means, but there is this feeling on my part, certainly, that Shamima Begum got a lot of attention for her cause because she was female. I mean, we mentioned, you started the show by talking about the Beatles, and we rarely hear about Mohammed Emwazi or El Shafi El Sheikh or any of those kind of young British men who are in similar situations now. But one of the things that's pointed out in your report, which might come as a big surprise to many people, is that women were well represented within the ranks of ISIS, and were guilty and accused of carrying out atrocities too. So I mean, I think we both understand that women tend to get the worst deal when you put a sort of hardcore fundamentalist theocracy in place. However, there were a substantial number of women, foreign fighters from the West, who were also complicit in the atrocities out there too.
Actually, yeah, that's a good point to raise, because I mean the title of the paper in some ways is a bit misleading, because it says Western foreign fighters, and that makes you picture the men that took to the battlefield and conducted attacks back in Europe and stuff like that when they returned. I stuck with Western foreign fighters because it's a term that people are familiar with and people know. But there is a whole, like you said, there's a whole section in there about the role of women as well, and this is another thing that Yazidi survivors are aware of. They're aware that we talk about the women in a very kind of infantilizing, condescending, and paternalistic way. That the vulnerable, misguided, manipulated woman trope, and some of the people who, you can go back to 2014, 15 and look at their social media output. Some of the people who were celebrating the Paris attacks and were openly kind of taunting the West, and some of the women, I should say, who have tried to sell that back to the West were the very people who were posting that kind of stuff, and now they're trying to, I don't blame them for trying their luck at it, because it is a discourse that's happening, but they're parroting our own kind of conversation back to us about them being vulnerable and misled and brainwashed and manipulated, and their behavior doesn't match up to that description.
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of first-hand accounts in this report, which I will link to in the show notes, and recommend everybody to, read over it just to get a handle on who the Yazidi are and what they faced since the rise and fall of the caliphate. And obviously they're still seeking justice for these atrocities. But one of the things that sticks out, which I suppose ties back into this earlier conversation we had about motivating ideology, is the fact that Islamic justification comes up time and time again. I was pleased to see you actually quote Nadia Murad in the report as well. She put out an excellent book on her ordeal at the hands of ISIS captors. I think it's called The Last Girl. I'll have to check. It's been a while since I've looked at that book. But she's essentially told by her captors at one point that you're essentially an infidel, so you deserve this. And that kind of thing comes up time and time again in your report. Instances of men praying to purify themselves beforehand and, praying afterwards, things like that. So it seems pretty on the nose to any sort of impartial observer that the role of religion is paramount to these people in their actions and the atrocities they're carrying. Even if we can agree that it's sort of the worst possible interpretation of Islam, it still nonetheless is justified by them in their interpretation of scriptures.
Yeah, I think Nadia Murad said, this was not an opportunistic crime. It wasn't opportunistic. It wasn't opportunistic, and it wasn't tactical or strategic either. Like the Yazidis didn't pose a kind of military threat to the expanding Islamic State at the time. But they put a lot of, as I've mentioned before, they put a lot of time and effort into justifying what they were about to do, and they had it signed off by their scholars and theologians before they did it. And the belief element, I'm sure there were some real kind of pieces of shit who just went and thought it'd be good to rape and assault people just for the fun of it. But you can see that the influence of their kind of sincerely held beliefs does impact the way that they treated their captives. Like you said, some people kind of prayed before and after they raped their victims. Some people told them why they were doing it while it was happening. And they gave these justifications. And Islamic State put out a hell of a lot of propaganda about this. And this is one of the interesting things about it. A lot of the genocides that have happened by by groups and regimes in the 20th and 21st century, the groups themselves or the states seek to downplay them. They seek to obscure them. But Islamic State was quite open about the facts of what they were doing, and some of the best records of why and what they did come from their own propaganda, which is very unusual. The Soviets never wanted the extent of the Gulag archipelago to be revealed in the West, and the Nazis never wanted the extent of the final question to be revealed even on the scale that it was to their own citizens. So it's a kind of unique in that way. But certainly the Islamic State ideology plays a role, and it didn't come from nowhere. That's the thing about it. It didn't, and this is what I was, to come back to what I mentioned before about taking the ISIS phenomenon out of its historical, sociological, geographical context. The justification for slavery in times of war exists in the more militant expressions of Salafism, for example. And even people who are in al-Muhajirun were talking about slavery in times of war before this happened. Sheikh Al-Faisal, who was a big recruiter, who's I think being in the middle of being extradited to the US from Jamaica, really influential in the British jihadi scene, before this was happening, was talking about slavery in times of war. So they didn't make this up. Like the precedent exists for it. That's the problem, and that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, they're great points, and obviously many of my listeners will be familiar with somebody like Anjem Choudhury, notorious hate preacher, UK based. Did some jail time not too long ago for encouraging support for a prescribed group, I believe was how that was termed. It was essentially encouraging people to join ISIS. Now, a lot of people were concerned at the time with something like that. And you mentioned Al-Mujaroon. I think that's another prescribed group in the UK, if I'm not mistaken. And so I suppose where's the line here, do you think? And this is a huge question, really. And where's the line between ensuring freedom of expression and religious freedom? Because some may argue that even the most sort of frothy-mouthed religious proclamation should be protected under the guise of free speech. So I suppose where's the line between banning certain groups and causes that are promoting Islamism versus guaranteeing freedom of expression?
Oh yeah, it's a horrendous question that European states. No, it's a horrendous question we need to address, but I think Western European states are going to have to face up to that in the next few years as well. I mean, I don't know if you caught it, but Austria, the Austrian government has taken the decision to ban political Islam outright. I don't know. I can't remember if they walked back on that initial proclamation or not, but certainly there was. I'll have to Google it afterwards, but certainly there was talk of banning it outright, and you'll have seen there was a huge fuss about President Macron's kind of measures he was taking against Islamism, but he never criminalized Islamist groups or anything like that, the non-violent Islamist groups. I'm not in favor of criminalizing like the non-violent Islamist groups. I'm quite in favor of the rule of law approach and like the kind of the stricter measures when people cross the line into terrorism. But groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and Jihadi Islamic and some of the front organizations that exist around the UK, like I'm not in favor of banning those groups at all, really. But I think an increasing number of European governments are going to wrestle with whether that's something they're going to do, or if there are ways that they can curb their influence before it needs to get to that point. Because it's not really been, we've had decades really of the growth of Islamist ideology inside a lot of European countries. And it's not really been addressed in any meaningful way until Macron, until Belgium started looking at it as well. Scandinavian countries as well have looked at it, and now Austria. But I think they're kind of really facing up to the fact that actually two things. A, there's a social cohesion problem here. They're breaking down social cohesion, and it's kind of threatening the integrity of the nation itself. But the second is that the role it plays in jihadist radicalization. And I think the consensus in a lot of Europe right now is that it's a serious threat to social cohesion, and it does play a role in kind of laying the groundwork for jihadist radicalization. So that's a huge question to watch as to how different European governments deal with that. And the other element to watch of that is how the Americans respond, because we saw how kind of hysterical, really, the American press was about what Macron was doing, and the kind of inaccurate portrayals about Macron's response to the murder of Samuel Paty and the attack in Nice a few days later. So I think this could be a real source of friction between the US and Europe in particular. Sorry to go off on a tangent, but especially as the US looks to deal more with the far right and white supremacy because of its own unique social conditions and political conditions. Europe's looks like it's facing up more to its non-violent Islamist threat. Bridging that gap in understanding, I think, is going to be quite a big challenge.
Yeah,
between allies.
I mean, the Samuel Paty murder was a big moment for many reasons, and yeah, you did some great writing on that as well. And I suppose one of the things that worries me that I find underpins a lot of this is that I sort of accept that extremists will do extreme things. What really blindsided me when I first started poking my nose in this conversation was the number of interest groups that would make excuses for them or attack the victim. And we seem to see this time and time again, and this ties into freedom of expression. Whenever there's a cartoon controversy that inevitably leads to someone's death, and then rather than an outpouring of condemnation of the murder and a reiteration of the right to satirize and mock Islam's prophet, we see many Islamic interest groups and quote unquote Islamic scholars and theologians signing petitions against the French government, attacking France, essentially accusing France of being responsible for these things because of its sort of, draconian anti-Muslim laws and laicite and things like that. And do we not have a massive problem here that extremism and jihadism aside, mainstream Islam in Europe is very conservative and not entirely conducive to the principle of free expression?
Well, I mean, it's not just the groups that you mentioned. I mean, even the kind of New York Times and the Washington Post columnists were taking that view, and even I think didn't Justin Trudeau make some pretty dodgy remarks in the aftermath as well. So I think just to stay with that for a second, I think there's a really increasingly distanced relationship to free expression on the kind of progressive left at the moment, and just really kind of there's really worrying, really, because it goes way beyond cartoons. It's the kind of the replacement of a kind of a cornerstone or a foundation of our societies, which is the right to free expression and freedom of belief and things like that, kind of being replaced with these ideas of like offense and hate, protection from offense and protection from hate, and like the elevation of minorities into like this kind of like super protected group that needs to and again it's really paternalistic and condescending, but I think that plays massively into this. So like it's all very well having those groups condemn it and stuff, but they're getting oxygen from way too many on the progressive left as well on this. And I mean, you have to look at it's a different issue, but you only have to look at like the hate crime laws that are going through in Scotland right now to look at the way that hate and offence is kind of replacing like I said, foundational principles of how our society is run. So I think this is a huge point of contention that we're going to have to deal with sooner or later. Is like what do we stand for? Do we stand for like protecting people from offence and hate, or do we stand for the right to free expression? On the point about interest groups and community representatives and leaders and things like that, I think there's a huge problem, and it's more pronounced with the cartoons issue than with any other issue. I think most thinking people condemn like the Manchester bombing or something like that as just an outright slaughter of children, but it does, when the cartoons comes into it, it definitely gets more complex, and again it does get some people are quite, in my view, kind of morally and intellectually confused about this question, because I think you alluded to this in your question. Like nobody says you have to like these things. Nobody says you have to like Charlie Hebdo or whatever it is. But if we can't unequivocally condemn a school teacher getting his head cut off in the street in broad daylight, then like, to be honest, the jihadist with the knife is the least of our problems. Yeah, like we've got serious problems there.
Seems like a very simple ethical conundrum, that one, doesn't it? Murder for cartoons, but it's it's surprising to me how many people get utterly exposed by very simple questions surrounding that topic. And I suppose, talking of very simple questions, do you think our mainstream media could do better to vet or challenge a lot of these interest groups who seem to be on a rotation like basis on our news media to opine on these things, because many of these groups, when you dig away at their beliefs and their proclamations, they're out and out Islamists themselves, and it's really frustrating to me, because I want to be able to point at secular liberal Muslims and say, listen to these guys, they're upholding liberal values such as freedom of expression, freedom to and from religion, and a lot of these groups are wheeled out under that guise as the sort of moderate voice, and then when you try and pin them down on issues such as stoning people for adultery or what's the correct punishment for homosexuals, they turn into either outright Islamists who just tell you what they think, or become very wriggly and won't give you a straight answer. So, I mean, could our news media do more to challenge these people? And I suppose it's just a case of them not recognising it because they're not very familiar with Islamic faith the way they would be with the Christian faith, given we live in a sort of culturally Christian country.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I don't really know the answer, because I think why shouldn't an Islamist group be able to say, go in the papers or write an opinion piece, or I'm not, like I said before, I'm not in favor of banning these people or taking their right to free speech or free expression away, but they do pose a unique challenge. I think the bigger unique challenge, and this is partly why some organizations I think were dissolved by the French government, was that they do pose as something else, and it makes it difficult for supporters as well, because a lot of people who support these groups will have no idea of like their kind of true nature, and or even people who work for them or volunteer for them won't really know kind of the bigger picture of what's going on. So they do pose a really unique challenge for liberal democracies, really. But the other thing is again, this isn't just exclusively a question about liberal secular Muslims versus Islamists. Like there are plenty of conservative Muslims who are not Islamists, who are in a way secular themselves. So and again, that comes back to what we spoke about right at the top, is like I think if we can see the political nature and treat this as a political phenomenon, I think we'd be a bit better placed to do like what you mentioned, to identify when there's a kind of political lobbying group, or when there's a real kind of political objective behind what's going on. But it's immensely difficult, because, as you know, not many people want to talk about this, and I understand why not many people want to talk about this. The charge of racism or Islamophobia is extremely damaging and gets thrown around when people talk about this. So I don't blame people for not wanting to talk about it.
Yeah, I suppose what frustrates me, I mean, you have some sort of crackpot Christian who blames the weather on homosexuality, and it's you have journalists lining up to cover it in the UK, and which is perfectly fine. But I often find out the truth about certain Muslim interest groups and figures from bloggers, or it's something I've uncovered myself, or it's something I've read in your work. And I don't think you're not typically you're not typically started out as a journalist for a newspaper. So I suppose that's what frustrates me a little bit, that people who have the platform and you trust to expose these kind of things just don't seem interested at all.
Yeah,
that's more of a moan than a question.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I don't know what the answer is, to be honest. It's tough. I mean, like to their credit, like the groups do this well, and to be honest, there's like some people have done a lot of damage on this as well. Like some people who have like labeled every Muslim group in the West as like an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood or something ridiculous like that. Like there's like conspiracy theorists on the right, and like what were the people who cropped up like mainly out of the US, especially in the 2000s, like the counter-jihad movement and stuff like that.
Right.
Like, they've done a lot of damage, I think, to the way we see this problem, and like dealing with this as like serious adults rather than, just like actually just being racist and throwing Molotov cocktails into the debate. So, yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, there'll be a lot.
Don't have an answer. Just endorsing your moan.
Yeah, no worries. It's good to talk. I feel better getting it out there now. So a lot of people who will be listening to this and learning about the Yazidis and have been aware of their plight for a while, and obviously empathise and care might be wondering what they can do. And I suppose I'm in the same position. I mean, how can the average, UK citizen have any sort of influence in this area? Are there groups we can support, organizations we can promote, things like that?
Yeah, definitely. There's, Yazda. If you look at the paper, Yazda was one of the organisations that helped me with the research for this. They're on the ground in Iraq, in Kurdistan, delivering supplies. They're lobbying for justice as well. They've got Amal Clooney, the kind of world famous human rights barrister.
She's
on their
brilliant.
side, I
think she wrote the forward for Nadia Murad's book as well, didn't she?
Yeah. And Nadia Murad's involved with Yazda as well, so that they're doing great work. And there's a very small operation as well. Who her name's Anne. She runs an organisation called Yazidi Emergency Support, and she's been tremendously helpful to me, especially like promoting some of the raising awareness of the work that I've done recently. So I'd be remiss not to give her a shout out as well. But I mean, there are other organisations, but in terms of justice, I think coming back to the myriad reasons why there hasn't been justice yet is like the lack of kind of political will and institutional demand for justice. So I think like the more we can collectively put that back up the agenda and show politicians that there is political and institutional demand here, then the better. But I mean, when I wrote the paper at the same time as talking about justice and the rule of law, and accountability, I'm not that optimistic about the chance for it, to be honest. I know that sounds awful, but one of my motivations for doing so was, I started going through a lot of interviews with, journalists who had interviewed captured foreign fighters from different countries in northern Syria. Some of the interviews with people who've come back and stuff like that, and I just thought, the Yazidi issue is completely missing from a lot of these interviews. Like some journalists did amazing work and pressed them on it, but like quite a lot didn't really press them on the Yazidi question, and like and their own accounts obviously don't address whether they raped a captive slave or whether they indoctrinated a child or something like that. So I thought this whole what happened here and the role of our own citizens is in danger of being written out of the history books, and that to me was like almost as bad as not getting justice. In the immediate timeframes that we're working in, that can't be allowed to happen. That can't be allowed to happen. That in 50 or 100 years, if somebody wants to look into this problem like that, the fact that our own citizens took part in it can't be out of the question. Can't be out of the equation. That needs to be in the historical account. So even if we can't get justice, I wanted to get as much as I could into one place. And I'm hoping this will be an ongoing piece of work to keep gathering more information as well, just to, if nothing else, contribute to the debate and the historical record. So, but yeah, like if there's groups out there that want to work on it or support, you can reach out to me personally as well. So I'd be more than happy to hear from people.
Yeah, that's great. I'll definitely be sure to put a link to the report in the show notes, because I can't recommend that highly enough. Everyone should spend a bit of time looking over that. So
it's not pleasant though. I think that's the warning. It's not pleasant.
It is harrowing in many places, but it's entirely necessary. Like you say, you can't really shy away from it. The public record on this is of huge importance, and so yeah, I'm very pleased you give up an hour to speak to me this evening. I mean, despite the topics and the content, it's always a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you.
Is there any other things you'd like to point people towards? Where can people find you specifically on your writing if they want to send you some praise or foul-mouthed abuse?
Save the foul-mouthed abuse. But I've written quite a lot recently for Unheard. I mentioned I haven't written as much recently because I've been doing that research and getting that paper ready and stuff. But hopefully be writing there again soon. Spectator. And also just like if you look on the CP website, Counter Extremism Project, and their social media channels, doing various talks with other experts. That makes me sound like I'm calling myself an expert, but academics and experts in the field and stuff that are always really interesting. So look at the YouTube channel, and there's some stuff on there. But I mean, also I should be thanking you because I think when I had like 400 or 500 followers or something on Twitter, you were retweeting my rants and my writing and my articles, and obviously that's been a massive help of lately, couple of years later, raising awareness for this Yazidi work. So massively indebted to you for that.
Oh man,
that's not too cringe.
No, it's my pleasure. You're doing some amazing work at the moment. So if there's anything I can do to get a few more eyes on it, then I've done exactly what I need to do. So I'm happy with that. Thank you.
No, thank you again.
All right, Liam, take it easy.
Cool. All done?
I thought, when you scratch your nose, then I thought for a second, he's going to blow me a kiss, isn't he? That's what he's going for.
I can do that.
We're out.